Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of European exploration. I know it feels like we've been talking about this for a while, and we definitely talked about the Renaissance for a really long time. I mean, going all the way back into June, am I right? The big thing about it, though, that you need to understand is that this is the first unit of AP European history, right? It's actually a comprehensive study of the Renaissance period and European exploration because they were happening at the exact same time, right? And they were also kind of like codependent drivers of one another in a really big way, which we'll talk about when we're reviewing, and we'll actually get into a little bit more as we get closer and closer to your test date, right? Speaking of your tests and stuff like that, I just want to go ahead and throw a big quick shout out to all of y'all real quick. I love how much more comfortable y'all are getting in class. You're getting a little bit more ability when it comes to asking questions, understanding things and stuff like that a little bit. And another thing I want to go ahead and let you know is I am going to be posting that exploration study guide today, all right? So I'm going to be putting that thing up there so you can actually kind of get a handle on it a little bit, go ahead and start crushing it and looking at some different things and studying all the kind of different stuff. Speaking of this study guide, well, also, too, just shout out to people like Carissa and, like Maylee and a couple of the other kids and stuff like that are really, really starting to step their game up in class. I am going to do what I promised I would do and introduce you to somebody really cute. Come here, Joby. Come here, old lady. All right, so this is the old lady that lives in our house. This is Miss Josie. Josie is a standard poodle. She's very sweet. She's about 10 years old. And she absolutely has heard all about y'all, because we talk every day. Isn't that right? What are you looking at? You looking outside? Oh, you looking at the flags and stuff? Are you going to go chase squirrels later? All right, so the big thing about it, though, is that's Miss Josie, all right? So, she said that she would be happy to meet you guys, and of course she always is, right? So the thing about it, though, is let's go ahead and jump right back into where we left off in class, talking about some of these New World, Old World, other developments and stuff like that going on, right? So we now actually have the presence in North and South America of the Spanish Empire, right? So the thing that's also what we left off on talking about is we're going to see some early French and English explorations that are actually going to kind of fizzle out a little bit, and they're not going to really do a ton of stuff, mostly due to the harsh climate, but they are going to discover large deposits of cod, and then also we're going to see a setup of the original European fur trapping organization that's going to be going on, so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, and that stuff right there, more than anything else, is content that you'll definitely use when you actually take AP US next year. That's exactly where Mr. Giardina starts, talking about the earliest actual, voyages of North and South America. Now, he'll go a little bit further in depth with AP US. Y'all will talk about De Soto, Ponce de Leon, he'll talk about Jacques Cartier, right? You'll talk about Cabot and some of these other early explorers that all kind of preceded the colonization period, which is going to be what we're getting into at the end of this flip today when we talk particularly about Spanish colonization, right? Oh, excuse me. Now, the big thing about it, though, is we also talked about the Treaty of Tordesillas, right? We took a second to kind of compare it to Full House, right? Because it's a lot like this episode from Full House.
Rule number 1, never touch my stuff. You should be taking notes. Rule number 2, never set foot on my half of the room. How do I get out of here?
Yes, exactly. The one where Stephanie and DJ draw the line down the middle of their room, right? The Treaty of Tordesillas is going to establish that thing known as the line of demarcation to try and keep Portugal and Spain from fighting one another. And then in the long run, another little guy that we talked about as well is Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian cartographer that was the very first one to figure out, hey, Joby, yes, you get comfortable. So now is going to be the very first one to figure out that it's actually two huge new land masses, and later cartographers are going to dedicate these new continents to him, calling them the Americas, right? North and South America, named after Amerigo Vespucci. Now, another guy you've probably heard about before, in one way or another, whether it be about a shirt that somebody might wear because there's a famous company named after him, or simply about the fact that you've heard about his expedition before. But we're talking about the Portuguese sailor Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan is going to begin a very, very large expedition in 1519 where he is going to attempt to circumnavigate the planet, right? So since the Portuguese and the Spanish are now fully aware that there are two big new land masses sitting over there in the West, everybody starts begging themselves the questions, what is on the other side? Can we even get to Asia from Europe? How would we even be possibly able to do that? Let's try to figure this out. So he actually embarks on a massive expedition to try and take several ships all the way around the planet. Now, the thing about it, though, is he's oftentimes given full credit for actually doing it. A lot of people, if you ever actually read into it and say, who was the very first person to actually circumnavigate the planet? The thing about it is they'll usually give credit to Magellan. Interesting little thing about it, though, is he actually did do it sort of, kind of, not really, due to the fact that he left Portugal in 1519 and is going to spend most of his time trying to get around South America, right? South America is going to have a very, very chaotic cape down here. As we know, this is the Cape of Good Hope, formerly known as the Cape of Storms. And then there's another cape down here that you'll probably need to understand in case it ever pops up on an AP test, and it's known as Cape Horn, all right? H-O-R-N, like a horn on a rhino or something like that, right? So the thing about it is it's a very, very climatic, just absolutely chaotic area, and some of you might have actually seen this video pop up on TikTok that actually talks about trying to get past it and stuff like that.
All eyes on me. Horrified looks from everyone in the room.
Yes, exactly. So as you can see, the bottom of South America is replete with storms and movement and massive swells of ocean water and stuff like that. Now, he actually did successfully get past it, and his voyage managed to get into what is now known as the Pacific Ocean. And he is actually the one, along with his expedition, that named the Pacific Ocean, because it was so chaotic when he was trying to get there, and then when he ended up in those new waters, he was like, oh, these are so calm and passive and peaceful. We shall call it the Pacific, right? And they actually refer to it as such because of his exploration. Now, the thing about it that I really, really take gripe with his exploration, though, about in general, is when he made it to the Philippines, he's gonna die. If you actually look at this super, super, super pixelated image, which I should have got a bigger one, and I apologize, it says, Magellan killed April 27th, 1521, right? Like, he actually gets decapitated by Filipino natives because he tries to convert them to Christianity, and they end up capturing and killing him. Now, his body ends up back on the boat, right? And so, that's why he's sometimes given credit, but it's kind of garbage because one of the only people that actually was of the original expedition wasn't white, and he's not given credit. He's actually a slave named Enrique, right? He's an African-born man. So the interesting thing about it is, in reality, the chances are is that the very first man to circumnavigate the planet is a man by the name of Enrique, who was an African-born slave, right? Because actually, I don't know if we should give credit to Magellan considering the fact that he was dead. Now, so big thing about it, though, is as you can tell, this circumnavigation of the planet, though, is going to kind of make this, Treaty of Tordesillas map a little even more kind of weird and important, because actually what's going to end up happening is the Spanish line is going to get drawn here as well with the Treaty of Saragossa after the entire circumnavigation campaign happens. And that is actually why, later on, the Philippines are called the Philippines, because the King of Spain at the time, when they tried to colonize them on the other side of this little line, was literally known as King Philip, right? So, now, the thing about it, though, is what's going to happen is you're going to see now a more accurate world map, and we're going to have an understanding of what else is out there, the massive continents that are actually being discovered. But now what we're getting into is what's going to happen when it comes to these Europeans and the natives that already live there, right? So we're now getting into the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish themselves. So the thing about it that you need to understand is we're going to start off this entire expose with the actual study of the very first real legitimate conquest of a massive empire of natives that did exist in North America, that is on my top 10 places I want to go see one day. I want to get to Mexico City, DF, so I can give these people the appreciation they deserve. So we're going to be talking about this Hernan Cortez and his conquest of the Aztecs, right? Now, so Hernando Cortez, or Hernan Cortez, as many European historians refer to him as, is in the pursuit of gold, right? That bloodlust of gold that actually started all back when Columbus saw gold jewelry on the Taino natives of the Caribbean. They had actually heard, in a very, very important little mistranslation kind of thing, that the Taino were aware of a massive empire of individuals that lived over in North America that apparently had so much gold they didn't even know what to do with it. So this will ignite that Spanish bloodlust, and they're going to go off and conquest this entire area. Now, the thing about Hernan Cortez is he took 600 men, 16 horses, and 10 cannons, and he planned on trying to take over a civilization that had over 10,000 people in an army strong. Now, not even just 10,000 people, but the thing that he's trying to get to is the Aztec capital. Now, to give you a little heads up, the Aztec capital is right here, okay? And it's known as Tenochtitlan, okay? If you want to go ahead and write it down, you totally can, because it might actually pop up on your test, right? The name of the city, the conquest itself. So Tenochtitlan is spelled T-O-N-O, let me start over. Try that again. Tenochtitlan, Tenochtitlan, right? And Tenochtitlan is actually located in present-day Mexico City, DF. And the capital of Mexico is actually built on top of it. Now, the thing that's really, really wild about Tenochtitlan is it actually wasn't home to just 10,000 people. It was home to over 1 million residents. I'm talking 10,000 military strong is what's going to go up. The Aztec military of over 10,000 is going to go up against these 600 Spanish in a very, very climactic battle that will change the tides of history. history. But Tenochtitlan, as you can see, is not something primitive. That's the entire thing I'm trying to get across with this whole flip. Is the biggest thing we need to understand is that the people that the Spanish are going to come into contact with are not what you would consider primitive. Remember, they just lack two things, right? In history, if you actually look at some evolutionary biology, and if you ever go decide and read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, you will understand that the lack of forgeable metals that the Aztecs never got a hold of, they never learned how to forge bronze or iron, and then also the fact that they didn't have large domesticated animals that end up with the diseases that the native or the Europeans had, which is going to make them very susceptible to things like smallpox, measles, and influenza, is going to be their ultimate downfall. It is not because of a lack of intelligence. Look at this place. It's like the Rome of the New World, right? And not only is it super, super important like then, but it's even important today in the modern era, because as you can see, they built their capital city of Tenochtitlan on top of a lake. Like, how ridiculous is that? They built it on top of a lake. They made man-made islands and built a massive capital on top of water. We give Venice in Italy so much credit for doing this, but they were doing it without forgeable metals and literally figuring out ways to farm on top of water. And their whole thing actually is related to Mexico's culture today. If you ever look at a Mexican flag, on the middle of it, it actually has an eagle sitting on top of a cactus with water underneath it, and he's got a snake clutched in his talons, right? Well, the thing about it that's actually interesting is before the Aztecs ever founded Tenochtitlan, they had heard a prophecy, right? And the prophecy said, you will wander the areas around this, you will wander the areas of your land to try and find your home, right? And your home will be signified when you see an eagle on a cactus clutching a snake, right? And they saw it in the middle of the lake, right? Like when they actually viewed it, they were like, all right, we got to found it out there. And they built their entire capital city out there. And they built it in concentric circles. And they even had a city-employed staff that would keep the streets clean. You got to think about how massively intelligent these people were. These right here are the artificial islands that they learned how to build. And they actually built on top of the water to create more land to farm on. Come on. That's insane. They're known as chinampas, right? Chinampas were actually developed by the Aztecs, literally using mats and mud, layered one on top of the other, reed mats and mud that were buoyant, and they would actually float them out into the lake and then use these trees to anchor them down into the base of the lake and underneath. And they grew things like corn, beans, squash, all these different items. Then they domesticated some waterfowl and stuff like that the best they absolutely could. But remember, they did lack those large domesticated animals, which actually made them very vulnerable to disease. The other really interesting thing about the Aztecs as well is some people do not even refer to them as the Aztec Empire in the historical community now. They actually sometimes refer to them as the Mexica Empire, right? And the Mexica Empire, because it does not only necessarily have to include the Aztecs, but it also includes all the people they took over. The Aztecs actually took over the entire lower area of what is now modern-day Mexico, going into this area of Belize over here as well. You have to understand, they were able to do this, and they had a massive military, and they took over this entire area, but it's actually going to set up some really, really bad situations. Now, we're going to get into that real quick, but the reason why they were able to do that so well has to do with the fact that they did create a type of weaponry that the rest of the people around them had never seen. The Aztecs, even though they lacked modern day forgeable metals to make things like guns and swords and armor and stuff with, they did have a weapon that the people around them never actually developed. And it has to do with, it looks like this, right? It's called obsidian, right? Obsidian, the rocks that actually are laid inside of this wooden paddle right here, are actually made from volcanic glass, right? So they had access to obsidian rock, and they would chisel it down into really razor sharp little edges and fit it onto the inside of a wooden mallet, and then they could actually swing it like a sword. And it gave them that ability to take over that much land, right? Which is absolutely wild. But now, yet again, you swing an obsidian sword against a steel one that's coming in from Spain, the steel one's going to win, right? Well, also the other thing that I just told you about 2 seconds ago is the taking over of all these people is going to mess them up a little bit, right? The Aztecs are actually going to be hated by all the people they take over. Reason why is because the Aztecs would take a donation from these places. They would take a donation in the form of human sacrifice as a form of taxation, right? So whenever Aztecs would actually try to hold religious ceremonies, they always were very ritualistic in this thing using human sacrifice. And they would sacrifice several, a lot of people, sometimes in the hundreds of people for special holidays, and they would literally rip their heart out of their chest using an obsidian knife and put it into one of these jaguar jars, right? And we'll talk about how they did that a little bit in class, because we'll sacrifice one of you, maybe Rogers or something like that. Now, the big thing about it, though, also is who was the guy leading the Aztecs when they came into contact with the Spanish is none other than this man named Moctezuma, right? Now, the reason why I'm talking about all this stuff, why is Mr. Terry going on about interesting facts about the Aztecs right now, is because they deserve this, okay? So the natives of this place deserve to not be looked upon upon as primitive and like just Indo-Asian American people or anything like that. Like, well, if you're talking about like the different theories of like migration patterns and stuff like that, but they do not deserve to be looked upon as primitive. It needs to be understood that if they had access to large domesticated animals and forgeable metal, obviously looking at the developments that they created, they would have been able to rival the Europeans. And also, who knows, if history played out a little bit differently, maybe they would have been the ones that found Europe before Europe found them, right? So now look, the other big thing that you need to understand about this mission that Cortez, now getting back into the whole thing, this is now going to be the story of Cortez when he goes and takes these people over, right? So the mission was supposed to be recon of this ridiculously, fabulously intelligent group of people, and also the absolute, like, ridiculous things he's going to see are going to blow his mind, right? Now, when I say recon, okay, now originally it wasn't even supposed to be Cortez's job. He wasn't even supposed to be one on it, but he actually kind of snaked his way back into being the guy in charge of the whole thing. And there was also a murder. We'll talk about that in class as well. The guy that was supposed to lead the entire thing showed up stabbed the morning of and stuff like that, and Cortez was like, oh, well, I'm here. I'll go. So what ends up happening is Cortez goes on this mission. And the Spanish governors back in Cuba, they tell him, hey, you're just going to check things out, right? You're going to check things out so we can figure out how many men we need to send over there so we can find all this gold that all the other natives have been talking about. He says, okay, I'll do that. But when he lands his boats in what is now modern day, like the border area between Belize and Mexico, he's decided to set his ships on fire. And the reason why he did that is because he told his men, I am not returning to Cuba to get arrested for some murder I may or may not have committed. And the other big thing about it is we are not like leaving this place without conquest and without goods, right? So he actually turned the entire thing into a mission of conquest. And also the other interesting thing about it that we need to understand is that Moctezuma knew they were coming. Acting like he didn't know is ridiculous, right? He actually knew and had heard that these foreigners were coming and they were riding these giant animals and they had all these different weapons that nobody had ever seen. And he was pretty worried. So he actually decided to send gifts to Cortez. He actually sent several emissaries through the woods and through the forest to go and interact with Cortez and the other Spanish to give them gifts of things like jaguar pelts and feathers and honey and wildflowers and stuff like that, and also some small gold idols to see if he could actually quench their thirst a little bit and that they would just go home. But the unfortunate side effect of these gifts actually increased like Cortez's want to go and conquer the Aztecs, and he decided to just follow them all the way through the woods and back to Tenochtitlan, right? And also, the other interesting thing about it is he had a translator with him as well. She's actually standing right there. She actually spoke both Maya and Aztec, and they had a very, very, like, kind of disgraced, like, priest, a Spanish priest that could speak Maya and Spanish. So they had to actually talk to two people just to talk to one Aztec person, and something got lost in translation whenever the gifts were being brought, and he said, how much more of this is there back where you're from? And the person in translation said, oh, there is more than you can imagine, right? Now, Cortez is going to also, while he's traveling towards Tenochtitlan, going to abuse the dissension within the Mexican Empire. He's going to go up to all those people that have been giving human sacrifices to the Aztecs this entire time, and he's going to tell them, look, hey, if we get into a fight with the Aztec, will you fight alongside with us against your oppressors? And a lot of them are going to agree. A total of 6,000 of them, actually. He actually creates an army of 6,000 natives and uses that dissension to his advantage, right? And Moctezuma, also sometimes spelled Montezuma. Some of you probably might have a fit and be like, well, which spelling is it? It depends on who you're asking, right? Because you're talking about a race of people that had their own pronunciations of things and a different written language. So over the years and stuff like that, we have two variant spellings of that man's name. Mocte with a C, and then Monte with an N, okay? Doesn't really matter which one, though. Just kind of know that both are actually referring to him. But when Cortez actually shows up, Moctezuma welcomes him with open arms, throws the doors of Tenochtitlan open and says, come on in, man, come on in, like, check things out. It'll be fine, it'll be fine. And then immediately what ends up happening is some of the early, like, actual negotiations. And in this picture, that's Montezuma actually sitting right there with, like, his translator, with Cortez and his translator to discuss about how they're going to proceed forward. Well, what ends up happening after Cortez tries to like encourage Christianity and things like that, the negotiations broke down. And the Aztecs actually are going to be, Moctezuma is going to be taken prisoner by Cortez and his men, right? And in one crazy instance, what's going to happen, this is really, really huge, okay? Moctezuma is brought out onto a balcony by Cortez with his men and stuff like that. And he orders Moctezuma to talk to the Aztec people for him and tell him to turn over their weapons and to begin to empty the city's gold out into like these large coffers and depositories, right? Well, the Aztec people are like, our God king, the thing that we literally consider God being our king and stuff like that, would never tell us to do this. And apparently, according to Spanish reports, the Aztec people picked up rocks and other blunt objects and threw them at Moctezuma, thinking he was an imposter, and actually killed him. So, like, there's a chance that he actually killed him. But then there are also reports as well that the Spanish may have actually decapitated and killed him as well. But what's going to end up happening is the Aztecs pick up weapons and stuff like that and actually attack the Spanish and drive them out of the city. But the thing about it is Cortez is going to return with that 6,000 strong native army of the people that hated the Aztec and use them to take over the city. And the reason why is because following the arrival of the Spanish, smallpox spread through Tenochtitlan like wildfire. We believe right now, just going forward into the grand scheme of things, evolutionary biologists believe that over 90 to 95% of the native populations of the Americas the ones that existed before the Spanish got there, will die due to the spread of disease alone, right? Like, think about that. 90% of those people, that is a genocide of levels, right? That is on the level of genocide, on the level of a holocaust of people. And the fact of the matter is it's never talked about that way. It's usually just simply talked about as the spread of disease, right? And so much of the city of Tenochtitlan will be destroyed when Cortez re-arrives, and he will raid, sack, and take anything he can get his hands on that is of any type of value whatsoever, right? And so in this entire process, the word will then spread back to Spain that there are large empires that have tons and tons of stuff that all the Spanish want. And by this point, there's a new Spanish leader. It's not Isabel and Ferdinand anymore. It's actually the Holy Roman Emperor and the Spanish king, one guy, same job, one guy, two jobs. His name is Charles V. And Charles V decides to send Cortez's second cousin, Francisco Pizarro, to try and go and take over these people known as the Inca, right? Now, the Inca are from modern-day Peru, and some of you have probably seen their religious capital. It's actually right here, right? It's called Machu Picchu. And some of you have probably seen this famous film by Disney that actually talks a lot about the Peruvians as well, and also about the Incans, because they're very, very famous for domesticating a certain animal.
The Emperor's New Groove. Uh-oh.
Don't tell me. We're about to go over a huge waterfowl.
Yep.
Sharp rocks at the bottom?
Most likely.
Bring it on.
Booyah! December 2000 in theaters everywhere.
That's exactly right. The Emperor's New Groove is one of my favorite films and stuff like that Disney has ever put out. Absolutely hilarious. But Machu Picchu right there is a testament to what the Incans were able to do in the mountains of the Andes. The Andes Mountains were very, very chaotic and intense, very hard to traverse, but the Incans were able to build massive cities within them. And also they built 10,000 miles worth of trade routes that actually span most of the western coast of what is now modern-day South America, going all the way from Peru to the northern tip of Chile. And they did all of this without having a written language, right? Like, which is absolutely wild. They had never seen writing before. They don't know what it is. The only thing that they actually knew of in any form of writing is they had these things. They're called quipus, right? Quipus are actually like strings with knots on them, and they use them as a numbering system to actually keep track of the trade items that went back and forth on those roads. And that right there is how they actually managed to farm inside the mountains themselves. It's called steppe farming, where they would actually carve into the mountains and create fields along the edges of the mountains, which is absolutely ridiculous. And in the process, they farmed one of the biggest crops that the world's ever going to see, potatoes, all right? We're going to bring that up here in a little while, right? But just know the Incans came up with potatoes, and they farmed them on those steep side mountains. And they used this animal right here to actually move a large amount of those products. Now, some of you are like, but Mr. Terry, I thought you said they didn't have large breed domesticated animals. Well, the thing about it is, in general, like llamas are the only large breed domesticated animal that anybody had ever seen in North or South America. And they also didn't domesticate a ton of them. And then also, they're not really considered like beasts of burden like horses are, because you can't ride them. They can only carry about like 80 pounds. So the thing about it, though, in the long run is that right there you're looking at is the only large breed domesticated animal that was ever actually bred. The only other thing that you need to know about the Incans as well, besides the fact that they're absolutely massively intelligent also, they also like actually apparently pioneered brain surgery first. There's a chance that the Incans were operating on people's skulls and stuff like that, while the Europeans were afraid of the plague in the 1300s. So going into it though, the Incans also sacrifice people, but they're most famous for sacrificing children, right? They actually sacrifice children in a ceremony where they usually sacrifice young boys and girls from villages of the different areas in Peru, but it was a little bit different. It was considered a great honor to give your child up to sacrifice, and usually the children were taken up into the mountains by a priest and were either strangled to death or bludgeoned to death by the priest after they had been given coca or alcohol. But the thing is that the body was then brought back and they were mummified. This body right here is over 1,000 years old, right? It is an Incan girl who was actually sacrificed, and her skin is still there. Her hair is still there. And she simply looks like she's sleeping. That's how good the Incan mummification techniques were, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in class as well. But that right there is Francisco Pizarro, the man that would successfully take over the Inca in a very, very intense battle that I'm going to draw up here on my entire board and stuff like that. But the thing you need to also understand is that when Pizarro arrived, he actually came with several of his brothers from Spain, and he had a very small force of only about 168 guys, about 4 cannons, and about 16 guns, right? And then, about 16 cavalrymen and some guns, right? He shows up, though, but the Incans were already very weak. And some of y'all are like, oh, is it because of disease? Yes, very, very good job. Y'all are so freaking smart. Yes, disease had began to spread through the Incan empires and killing a large number of people in their entire civilization. Smallpox actually hit them before the Spanish ever even showed up to take them over. And also, there was a civil war that had claimed the lives of a lot of Incans as well. The Incan king had died, and what had happened was his 2 sons battled one another to try and see who would take over. And the winner was a man by the name of Atahualpa, right? Atahualpa is the guy who ends up winning the civil war days before before the Spanish show up, which is so tragic, right? So the thing about it is King Atahualpa, right, actually had heard of these foreigners coming. Runners had showed up and been like, hey, there's these guys on giant, scary llamas, and they have these things that kill people, and we can't even see how they do it, right? And he says, okay, fine, we are going to set possibly a trap or at least a military strategy to try and interact with these people before they get there. Because he had also probably heard of the Aztecs and stuff like that and what had gone down in Tenochtitlan. But what you need to understand is this thing is going to be known, or this event in history is going to be called the Battle of Cajamarca, right? And it happened in 1532. So the thing about it is it took place in the Incan city of Cajamarca, right? So the thing about it is that city right there, actually Atahualpa had over 6,000 troops with him, stationed in this place. Then he had just heard that he had won the Civil War and that his brother had been captured. But he decided to actually have a meeting with the Spanish here as well. And at the Battle of Cajamarca in 1532, the reason why this thing is so important is because it demonstrates to us the technological advantages of the Spanish over the native people and the fact that it was going to be borderline impossible for the natives to really ever fight back in a major way and liberate themselves, right? Well, what had happened was there's only 162 Spaniards, or 160-ish, right, Spaniards, versus about 6,000 Incan troops. And the entire idea was that Atahualpa was like, oh, well, we'll bring in all of our troops and we'll line them all up right here, right? We'll line them all up in these huge things. There's no way that there's only a handful of them that they could beat our Incan troops. But the problem is that you have to understand is that Incans didn't learn how to forge metal either. And they didn't even have obsidian weapons like the Aztecs did. They actually had stone weapons. One, a very, very famous one is called a bolas, right? A bolas is the 3 rocks on the strings and stuff, and you swing it and you throw it, okay? Those kind of weapons is what the Incans were coming up in with. They also had cloth armor, right? But the plan of the Spanish was they were like, oh, well, look, we're going to use our strategy to our advantage. And inside the buildings in this square of this city of Cajamarca, they hid all the Spanish men out of sight of Atahualpa and his troops. And apparently they were all petrified, right? They were all freaking out because they saw 6,000 Incan soldiers and their king come in. And also, y'all got to understand, too, when Atahualpa came into the square, he didn't just walk in. He got brought in on what's called a litter. It's like a stretcher thing that you carry on your shoulder. So he was actually elevated above everyone, sitting on top of a throne. And the strategy was this. The Spanish decided that they would send an emissary out to talk to Atahualpa. And the guy would come out right here, right? And when he went up there to talk to Atahualpa, it was going to be a priest. And the priest went out there and yelled to Atahualpa that he must submit to the Spanish religion, submit to the church, may it be his mistress, and then also he must submit to the king and everything else going forward. And apparently, the Spaniard priest handed Atahualpa a book, a Bible. He handed him a Bible, and then but the problem is that Atahualpa, he doesn't know how to read, right? So he doesn't have a written language. He's only ever seen quipus in his entire life, right? So what ends up happening is Atahualpa just kind of flips through the pages and goes what the heck am I supposed to do with this? And he throws it to the ground. And then at that moment, the priest signaled, throwing a cross up in the air, and said, come out, Christians. And they began to fire their guns into the middle of the square, shooting and killing as many Incans as they possibly could. The loud noise caused so much confusion that the Incans tried to run out of 2 narrow passageways and ended up trampling each other en masse. And apparently, according to reports, over 2,000 Incans died on this day. All right, but only 1 Spaniard was injured, apparently close to what we would refer to as a sprained ankle, right? Which is absolutely insane. So the thing that you have to understand is that battle is a very pivotal moment in history, because it was at that moment that what's going to happen is the Spanish are going to take over the Inca at that one infamous day. The Spaniards after that are going to hold Atahualpa ransom for massive roomfuls of gold, and we'll talk about that in class as well. Just go ahead and finish jotting this down, and we'll go elaborate on it a little bit in class. And eventually they're going to execute him even after the ransom is paid. And once this happens, is the Spaniards are going to stumble onto a vast amount of wealth from gold and silver from Incan money that has been mined out of the ground. Y'all, the amount of money that apparently the Spaniards found when they raided other Incan cities and villages was equal to 400 million modern US dollars, right? So, which is absolutely insane. And they did it while killing as many people as they possibly could, committing yet another, again, what we refer to as a genocide, right? So we'll talk more about that in class, though, and then we're going to talk about the Spanish when they set up colonies and stuff like that, talk about the encomienda system, and how they're going to basically start creating sugarcane plantations and mining operations that will further destroy the Native Americans that actually lived in these places. We'll talk about that when we get back to class, and then you're going to have one little short baby flip going into your test, but I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.